Richard has been released and the treacherous John has been forgiven. With the army of England amassed and prepared to take on the forces of Philip of France and his supporters, the Lionheart is ready to be unleashed on Normandy one final time. By his side until the bitter end is the ever-loyal Earl Robert of Leicester. But when John ascends to the throne, Robert's loyalty will be tested as the very existence of the Anglo-Norman realm hangs in the balance. Welcome to the final chapter of Casino Royale, Part 8, Severance. Richard's army landed at Barfleur in mid-May 1194, arriving in over 300 boats. By now, Philip had control of much of the Normandy east of the Seine and was in the process of besieging the castle Verneuil. Richard marched his forces straight for the castle, but as they approached, Philip retreated and the King of England entered the town unopposed on the 30th of May. Throughout June, Richard's forces moved south through Normandy, taking a number of important fortresses, whilst Philip's campaign in the north of the region stuttered to a halt. This is not to say that there weren't losses for Richard, and it was at this time that, whilst fighting in a skirmish outside of the town of Gournay, that Robert de Beaumont was captured by King Philip's forces. For the next year and a half, as the conflict between Richard and Philip raged around him, the Earl of Leicester remained helplessly imprisoned. Robert Lee eventually secured his freedom in February 1196 by surrendering his castle and lordship of Plessis-sur-Aire, a town between Paris and Evreux, to the French king. Shortly after his release, the now 30-ish-year-old Robert marries the teenage Loretta de Braose, the daughter of one of the most powerful barons of the Welsh Marches. As part of her dowry, Loretta brought Tavistock, a town near Barnstaple in Devon, which perhaps helped compensate a little for Robert's French losses. However, soon the Earl of Leicester was back campaigning beside his king in Normandy, where he remained throughout 1197 and 1198. On the 27th of September 1198, the two opposing forces met close to the town of Gisors. Despite the Frankish army's superior numbers, the Anglo-Normans defeated the French and captured many prominent knights. The French fled by crossing the bridge in the town, which broke under their weight, with Philip on it. As Richard delightedly reported to the Bishop of Durham, the King of France, we have heard say, had to drink the river. Having been pulled from the water by his troops, Philip escaped to the still French-held castle at Gisors, before suing for a temporary truce. It was also at this battle that Richard adopted the motto Dieu et mon droit, which translates as God and my right, emphasising the king's claim that his rank acknowledged no superior but God. This motto is still used by the British monarchy to this day. By January 1199, the warring sides were deadlocked, although by this point Richard had regained almost all of the territory he had lost to Philip in 1193. At their final meeting in mid-January, the two kings were unable to agree terms for a permanent peace, but they did agree to further mediation that would result in a 5-year truce. With the truce in the north now agreed, Richard was now free to quell the uprisings that had sprung up in support of Philip in Aquitaine. As twilight fell on the evening of the 26th of March 1199, Richard's army was besieging a small castle belonging to the Viscount of Limoges. The king's forces were busy undermining the castle's defensive when Richard took a stroll amongst his men. Spotting a lone defender on the parapet, armed with just a crossbow and a frying pan for defence, Richard thought to take the opportunity to test his own skill, requesting the crossbow from one of his men. As Richard started to arm himself, the defender saw what was happening and took a pot shot of his own. As the crossbow bolt came hurtling towards him, Richard openly applauded the defender's accuracy before stepping back behind his shield. But he mistimed his evasive manoeuvre and the bolt hit him in the left shoulder. Despite immense pain, the king didn't make a sound, so as not to alarm his men. Instead, he withdrew to his tent and attempted to remove the bolt himself, but he succeeded in only snapping the wooden shaft and leaving the arrowhead in his shoulder. The royal surgeon was called and the rest of the bolt was extracted, but not before, in the words of one chronicler, the shoulder had been carelessly mangled. Over the coming days, the king remained in his tent whilst the siege continued around him, and only Richard's most trusted advisors, including the Earl of Leicester, were allowed to see him. But the king's health deteriorated as infection set in and the wound became gangrenous. Recognising what was happening, Richard wrote to his mother, Ellen of Aquitaine, asking her to come and see him before the end. The Viscount's castle fell and the defending garrison were all executed, except the defender who had shot the king. He was brought before Richard, who asked him weakly, "What wrong have I done you that you should kill me?" To which the man replied, "With your own hand you killed my father and 2 brothers, and you intended to kill me. Take your revenge in any way you like. Now that I've seen you on your deathbed, I shall endure any torment you may devise." Smiling, Richard forgave the man and ordered his release. Unfortunately, after Richard's death, his soldiers ignored the king's final orders, dragging the defender to be flayed alive before being strung up and hung by the neck. By now, Eleanor had arrived, and Richard used his remaining time to set his affairs in order, reiterating that his brother John was heir to his throne. As night fell on the 6th of April 1199, 11 days after he was wounded, Richard the Lionheart, the crusading king and hero of the Holy Land, died in his mother's arms. Close by, quite possibly in the royal tent, was the Earl of Leicester, and for the 4th time in as many generations, a de Beaumont bore witness to the death of a king of England. Let's move on. It's difficult to imagine what Earl Robert's feelings were towards Prince John. His father, Robert Blanchemain, had famously rebelled against King Henry because of the king's favouritism towards John, and although the 4th Earl of Leicester had had an association with the prince since Richard's ascension to the throne in 1189, it's not hard to imagine the anger and frustration he felt upon returning from the Crusades to find John in open rebellion to his brother and having effectively gifted Norman lands to Philip of France. However, perhaps seeing how his liege lord, King Richard, had turned the other cheek and forgiven John, perhaps the Earl of Leicester truly did the same, because by the time Richard died, de Beaumont was a firm supporter of John's succession and was rewarded accordingly, becoming Lord High Steward to the new king at his coronation on the 27th of May 1199, a position formerly held by his grandfather Robert le Bossu for Henry II. But John's reign was not to be a peaceful one. Despite having the support of the dying Richard and much of the English and Norman nobility, there was another claimant to the English throne, Richard and John's teenage nephew Arthur, and it wasn't clear whose claim had superiority. According to Norman law, as John was the only surviving son of Henry II, his claim was strongest. However, Angevin law, the law of the ancestral lands of the Plantagenets from whom both John and Arthur were descended, placed Arthur's claim higher because he was the son of John's deceased older brother Geoffrey. Arthur now received the support of the nobles of Breton, Maine, Anjou, and of course Philip II of France, who was always looking to curtail Plantagenet and English power on the continent. Before the war between Philip and Richard had had time to settle, a new war between Philip and the new King of England erupted. Following his coronation in Westminster Abbey, John swept into France with his forces and formed a defensive line along the eastern and southern Norman borders. John and his supporters then marched on Le Mans and had captured the town, seat of the powerful Angevin baron William de Roche, by late September. De Roche then used his influence to have Arthur brought to Le Mans, where he paid homage to his uncle and formally recognised John's right to inherit all of Richard's lands. This in turn led to a truce between John and Philip, in which Philip abandoned his support for Arthur and recognised John as rightful heir to all Richard's French possessions. John in turn accepted Philip as the legitimate feudal overlord of his lands in France, something Richard had refused to do, and which earned the English king the nickname John Softsword in some quarters. In fairness to John, he probably thought he was achieving a lasting peace with Philip that would stabilise control over his continental lands, something Richard had never achieved. But the settlement opened a legal loophole by which John could be summoned to the French court by Philip, not as the Duke of Normandy, which was exempt from such feudal rules, but as the Count of Poitou, who was subject to the King of France's overlordship. So when John decided to marry Isabella of Angoulême in 1200, who was already engaged to Hugh IX of Louisiane, Hugh appealed to the French king, and Philip in turn summoned John to the French court in Paris to answer the accusation. When John failed to appear, seeing the summons as a weakening of his authority in western France, Philip declared him in breach of his feudal responsibilities and reassigned all of John's lands that fell under the French crown to Arthur, with, of course, the exception of Normandy, which he now claimed for himself. And so began a fresh war between the kings of England and France. Arguably, this was an easily avoidable war. Had John simply sought to compensate Hugh for the loss and embarrassment caused by his engagement to the teenage Isabel, things most likely could have been smoothed over. But instead, when Hugh initially complained to John about the matter, he was treated with such utter contempt it led to an uprising by Hugh's supporters in Louisiane, which John then brutally crushed, leaving Hugh little recourse but to appeal to King Philip. Time and again throughout his reign, and before it to be fair, we see John display this blind arrogance, a distinct lack of empathy, and an almost willful ineptitude at people management. These flaws, which seemed so stark compared to the competent and chivalrous King Richard, would eventually lead to Runnymede, Magna Carta, and a damning reputation as one of the most incompetent monarchs in English history. But John could be brilliant in battle. One of the best examples of this was in July 1202, shortly after Philip and Arthur began the latest war. Arthur, Hugh of Louisiane, and all the rebel leaders from Aquitaine had besieged the now ailing Eleanor in her castle at Mirabeau, close to the Marseille, in the very south of France. In a brilliantly decisive move, John led his army at great speed to Mirabeau and besieged the besiegers, taking Arthur and his force by such surprise that Geoffrey de Lusignan was captured whilst dining on a breakfast of pigeons. Within hours, John had secured a stunning victory, capturing almost all of his principal enemies in one go, including potential rival, his nephew Arthur, before dragging them back to Normandy in chains. In the words of one historian, it was as if John had popped up as through a trapdoor with the suddenness of a demon king. This staggering victory should have all but ended the war, but again John's mistrust of his own barons, unwillingness to delegate any power, and decisions to deliberately snub some of the strongest supporters meant that by September 1202 key allies were now defecting to Philip, and by November that year John had effectively lost the southern half of his Norman lands. It is at this point that John stoops to his lowest. At some point in late 1202 or early 1203, John decided to remove the threat of Arthur, who could so easily become a focal point of rebellion against him. He orders one of his knights, Hubert de Burgh, to mutilate the 15-year-old boy, blinding and castrating him. But the horrified de Burgh refuses, so John has Arthur moved to his capital castle at Rouen, where he vanishes from public view. In a tale that is very reminiscent of Richard III and the Princes in the Tower, rumours start to circulate that John has had his nephew killed. Historians still debate Arthur's fate, but an account in 1207 by Matilda, the wife of William de Brioze, a close associate of the king at the time, claims that on the 3rd of April 1203, in a drunken rage, John had Arthur brought up to the top of the castle tower and, possessed by the devil, he slew him with his own hands and, tying a heavy stone to the body, cast it into the Seine. Whatever the truth of the story, the rumour that John had brutally murdered his young nephew by his own hands gained momentum and added to the general fears after the loss of southern Normandy and the concerns about whether the king could be trusted. Soon more Norman nobles were defecting to Philip, and the balance of the war shifted significantly in France's favour. Although we don't know where Robert de Beaumont is throughout this period, it is reasonable to expect that, given his huge estates in Normandy, he is fighting in France. However, whether this means that he is keeping Philip occupied and holding the Norman frontier whilst John led the army to Mirabeau, or whether he was part of the daring rescue mission, we simply don't know. We also don't know what, if any, part he played in the disappearance of Arthur. But what is clear is that throughout this period he remains loyal to John, so much so that in September 1203 John rewards Robert for his generous support by granting him Richmondshire in Yorkshire. By August 1203, having taken numerous of John's estates, Philip focused his siege engines on the keystone of the Norman defences, Richard I's impregnable fortress, Chateau Gaillard. Based in Rouen, John tried all that he could to break the siege of his beloved castle, but Philip would not be deterred or distracted. By the winter, John was rapidly losing confidence and becoming increasingly indecisive and paranoid. On the 6th of December 1203, his courage deserts him entirely and, under the pretext of gathering reinforcements, John abandons Rouen and heads to England. He would never again return to an English-ruled Normandy. In all credit to the stalwart defenders of Chateau Gaillard, the castle wouldn't eventually fall until the following March. This was thanks mostly to Richard I's obsession with constructing the chateau to be the perfect defence. In fact, the eventual downfall of the castle came as a result of the chapel that John had later added that created a weakness in its structure. On the 1st of April 1204, the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose husband's domains had spanned so much of England and France, died at Fontevraud Castle, which was now in the hands of the hated Philip of France. Later that month, desperately trying to salvage what he could of his Norman lands, John sent a delegation of his leading officials, including Earl Robert of Leicester, to broker a truce with Philip. But it was too little, too late. The French king had no need to negotiate a peace deal, having already smashed the Norman defences. From this position of strength, and strongly suspecting that Arthur was already dead, Philip offered peace on the condition that John handed over the young prince. But John could not. So on the 24th of June 1204, having mopped up the surrounding strongholds, King Philip II of France triumphantly enters the Norman capital of Rouen. In doing so, not only did he fundamentally redraw the French map, he ended 140 years of Anglo-Norman rule. Normandy was not so close anymore. And despite repeated attempts over the coming centuries, never again would an English monarch hold such power in mainland Europe. It wasn't just the loss of the king's land that effectively ripped the Anglo-Norman realm apart. It was the fact that almost all of the English and Norman nobility, most of whom had substantial lands on both sides of the Channel, had to choose sides. And if they chose John, their Norman lands were confiscated by Philip, and if they chose the French king, John seized their English lands. Most of the nobles, therefore, chose the country in which they personally held the largest estates, and therefore remained the richest, even if this meant having to leave close family and friends behind. Three men in particular faced huge losses by choosing England over Normandy: Ranulph, Earl of Chester, William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, and Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester. However, having perhaps seen where the wind was blowing back in April when they were part of John's delegation to sue for peace, both Marshal and de Beaumont had used the opportunity to make separate agreement with Philip, which gave them a year and a day to make their decision about which estates and, crucially, which king they would ultimately support. Sadly, however, Earl Robert would never have to make that difficult choice. On the 20th or 21st of October 1204, Robert de Beaumont, 4th Earl of Leicester, died aged relatively young at around 40 years old. Although there is no certainty around his cause of death, it is reported in the life of St. Hugh of Lincoln that the Earl died of leprosy. If this was the cause of his death, it would seem cruelly ironic for the crusading Earl, as it is believed that one of the routes by which the disease entered Europe from Africa and the northeast was via the movement of the same crusading armies that he had been part of. Leprosy was clearly rife in Leicestershire in the 12th century, when the Order of St. Lazarus, a Catholic military order of crusaders, founded a leper hospital on a hill next to the village of Burton here, just 2 miles southeast of Melton Mowbray. The hospital became the Order's headquarters for all of its English estates and raised large sums of money to fund the Order's activities both here and in the Holy Land. The village itself was renamed Burton St Lazarus, but that soon became abbreviated to Burton Lazars. Regardless of the cause of his death, Robert de Beaumont, the fourth and final of the de Beaumont Earls of Leicester, was laid to rest in the choir of Leicester Abbey, beside his distinguished forebears. Despite arguably gambling the least in the medieval game of royal roulette, loyally following both Richard and John, with the demise of the whole of Normandy, it's him that seems to have lost the very most. The Anglo-Norman period exploded into British history with the arrival of William the Conqueror in 1066. There to witness the birth of this new realm was the teenage Robert de Beaumont. The kingdom would eventually sputter out in the early years of the 13th century, with its final death throes watched over by Robert's great-grandson, the 4th Earl of Leicester, one of the last great cross-channel Norman magnates. Over the tumultuous course of 138 years, a de Beaumont was at the very centre of royal affairs, bearing witness to the deaths and/or coronations of 6 successive kings of England. Never again would the Earls of Leicester hold such sustained prominence at the court or in the shaping of the country's affairs. And matching each of the Earls' victories and defeats and each of their royal gambles was the prosperity of the people of Leicester and Leicestershire. For much of the time, the population would have continued their lives of farming and crafting and trading, almost oblivious to the machinations of their lords and masters. But the severe disruptions, hardship and bloodshed brought by the anarchy and the 1173 siege of Leicester would have brutally punctuated the substantial periods of growth and prosperity in the town, which were assisted by the huge capital spends of the Earls of Leicester. For the townspeople too then, the rota fortunae, that wheel of fortune, was equally capricious, bringing sometimes prosperity and others despair. It's hard to imagine the town of Leicester as it was 800–900 years ago. That's because so little of that town is still visible. Only through the castle precinct, St Mary de Castro Church and the ruins of Leicester Abbey can we get any sense of the de Beaumont Earls' legacy. There is, however, one gift left to us by the de Beaumonts that the people of Leicester still see on a regular basis all across the town: their coat of arms. A cinquefoil pierced ermine on a red background, which was officially adopted as the town's coat of arms in 1619 and, more recently, can be seen behind that other enduring emblem of Leicester's dogged determination, the Leicester City Football Club Fox. But what of the earldom itself after Robert Brotteaux? The final Earl died childless, and so the de Beaumont estates were divided between Robert's sisters, the 2 daughters of Robert Blanchemains. The earldom and town of Leicester went to the eldest sister, Amice, and then down to her descendants. Amice was married to a powerful French nobleman and warrior, and, in time, their son would forever be associated with Leicester for both great and terrible deeds. His name was Simon de Montfort. But that, as they say, is a whole other story. So thanks for watching.